I don't know why I still take these night walks. The air always feels heavier after dark, as though the trees lean closer, listening. The gravel crunches softly under my boots, and somewhere in the distance, an owl gives a low cry before the silence swallows it. Fog curls between the branches, catching on pale beams of the moon. Every step feels like I'm crossing deeper into something that doesn't want me here. Sometimes I stop and just listen. The hum of the power lines fades, and the stillness becomes unbearable. I convince myself it's nothing, just the wind, just the forest, just my own thoughts echoing back at me. But then the lights flicker behind the tree line. A faint glow, like a lantern swaying in the fog. I tell myself not to follow it. I tell myself to keep walking, to head home. But every time curiosity wins. And that's when I saw it. The trail was nearly swallowed by fog. Night hung heavy in the pines, the air damp and cold. Every footstep sank into the soft earth, muffled by mist. A faint glow caught my eye, between the trees. A lantern swaying gently as if cradled by invisible hands. No one stood near it. I hesitated, drawn closer by the warmth of the light. It pulsed softly like a heartbeat. The fog thickened, curling around my ankles, rising with every step. The scent of wet soil mixed with the faint smoke from the lantern. I felt it tugging me deeper into the trail, urging me forward. Branches brushed my arms, cold, wet, scratching through my jacket. The world behind me blurred, shadows pooling under the trees. Each inhale brought the chill of damp air and the faint iron tang of fear. I stepped forward. The lantern swung again, slower now, as though waiting. I whispered, just a sound lost in the fog. No reply. But the light moved closer, a guide through the mist. Something in the silence pressed against my skin, soft and weightless. I could hear the subtle rustle of unseen leaves. A faint hum lingered, vibrating low, almost in rhythm with my heartbeat. The glow wrapped around the trunks of the pines, spilling warmth, and yet the path seemed endless, curling inward, hiding its edges. I turned briefly to check the trail behind me. Nothing, only fog. The trees had swallowed the path. The lantern's light pulsed, and I realized I could not retrace my steps. A branch snapped somewhere to my left. I froze. The mist pressed against my face, wet and cold, and the light hung there, swaying without a hand. I felt small, alone. The kind of alone that goes deeper than distance. It seeped into my chest, slow, heavy, and unrelenting. I took another step. The glow shivered, moving further down the trail, as if leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. The air smelled faintly of smoke and moss. I tried to call out, but my voice barely surfaced, swallowed by fog. The lantern dipped low, flickering as though uncertain. I followed, though my legs felt heavier with each step. The mist wound around my ankles, up my legs, pressing me into silence, into stillness I could not break. Time lost meaning. I didn't know if I had walked for seconds or hours. Only the lantern remained, faint and swaying, a ghost suspended in a forest that had forgotten the world outside. Then, without warning, the light vanished. The lantern was gone. The glow, the pulse, the warmth, it all disappeared. I spun around. The path I had taken had vanished. The trees had closed in, leaving me in a gray world of fog and shadow. The silence became something heavier, alive in its emptiness. I could feel the cold damp pressing closer. A shadow moved, or perhaps it was only the mist shifting. I could no longer tell the ground from the fog. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. Every sense heightened. Every step uncertain. I stood there, the forest unblinking, and the dread sank deeper. Isolation wrapped around me, slow and suffocating, like the fog itself. I wanted to run, but the fog held me. I wanted to cry out, but the night absorbed my voice. Only the emptiness remained, and the memory of a lantern that never belonged to anyone. And somewhere, beneath the hush of trees and mist, I knew I would not find the trail again. The forest had me, and I was utterly, quietly alone. The gravel crunched beneath my feet. Night was cold, damp, and still, yet the air seemed to hum with something unseen. Each step echoed, swallowed quickly by the darkness. Then I heard it. A second crunch, soft, matching mine exactly. I froze. My own heartbeat sounded loud in my ears. I took a careful step forward. The footsteps followed, mirroring me perfectly. Faster, slower. Every time I stopped, they stopped. I whispered into the dark. "Who's there?" My words barely left my lips. And yet I heard them again, closer, carried on the night, almost in my own voice. I swallowed hard, tasting the cold on my tongue. The gravel pressed into my shoes, sharp and uneven. The fog curled low, hugging the trail, hiding the shadows between the trees. I moved again. Crunch, crunch. The other pair stayed with me. Always just a step behind, a twig snapped to my left. I jerked my head toward the sound. Nothing. Just the trees stretching tall and still, indifferent. I tried to imagine the person, if it was a person, walking behind me. Tall, small, human. But the sound, it wasn't quite human. It carried a weight, deliberate, patient. I whispered again, quieter this time. A single word, almost a prayer. And it came back, closer, sharper. Not just echoing, but imitating, as if something had learned the shape of my voice. The fog thickened. Each breath I drew felt damp and heavy. My hands itched, my fingers numb from the cold, but I kept moving forward, unable to stop. The crunch of the gravel beneath my shoes became a rhythm. Crunch, crunch. I tried to step off the path into the soft earth. The footsteps followed, perfectly aligned with mine. I swallowed my fear, trying to reason with the night. No one could keep pace so precisely. No one could echo every sound, every whisper. Yet it did. A cold gust, or maybe nothing, rustled the branches above. The sound of leaves brushing together mirrored the steps, soft, careful. I felt the night pressing closer, alive in a quiet, patient way. I whispered again. My voice cracked this time. The reply, my own words, just a breath away, made my skin crawl. Closer than possible. Too close! I wanted to run! My legs were heavy, my body tense. Every movement was a struggle, each step a test. Crunch, crunch. The footsteps stayed behind me, following, shaping themselves to my pace. I stopped completely. The fog thickened to a curtain, swallowing everything beyond a few feet. Silence. Or almost silence. Then, the faintest shift, a movement in rhythm with my own. I held my breath. A twig cracked under a weight I could not see. A shadow stretched across the gravel, bending, moving without origin. I wanted to turn, but I was frozen. The footsteps started again. Soft, deliberate, closer. Not ahead, not behind. Beside me, the night pressed in on every side. I could smell damp soil, the faint metallic tang of fear. My clothes were wet from fog sticking to my skin. The crunching never stopped, I whispered, almost begging. But the answer came differently this time. Not echoing words. A soft, deliberate breath, warm, deliberate, matching mine. I spun. Nothing. Just fog, gravel, and the trees. The path stretched forward, dark and endless. I tried to run. My legs pumped, lungs burning. The footsteps kept pace. Always a step behind, or beside, always echoing, always watching. The night was alive now. Not with wind, not with creatures, not with sound, but with attention, a presence measured, patient, and impossibly close. I couldn't tell where I ended and the footsteps began. I couldn't tell if I had ever been alone. I only knew the weight of being followed, echoed, mirrored, and drawn into the dark rhythm of something patient. Every step, every whisper, every breath was no longer mine alone. I was walking with something that understood me better than I understood myself. The fog thickened further. The path disappeared behind me, swallowed whole by night. The gravel softened underfoot, becoming earth, then nothing. And still the footsteps never stopped. Always matching, always close, always patient. Waiting. The edge of the forest was darker than the rest. The trees thinned, their trunks pale in the faint glow of a flickering street lamp. Night air smelled of damp earth and something older, something patient. I walked along the path, shoes crunching over gravel. The fog was lighter here, but the shadows were sharper, folding into shapes that didn't belong. Then I saw him, a tall figure, standing perfectly still, just beyond the chain-link fence. The pale light caught only the outline, no features, just shadow. I froze, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks. He didn't move, didn't breathe, at least not in a way I could see. The faint wind whispered through the fence, but the figure stayed, unwavering, silent. I tried to look away. A prickle ran down my neck, the kind that told you fear was not imaginary. Yet curiosity kept me there, anchored to the gravel beneath my feet. The street lamp flickered again, throwing the forest into alternating pools of light and darkness. For a moment, I thought he was gone. Then the light died completely. He was closer, closer than the fence should have allowed, closer than any shadow should have moved without notice. The air around me thickened. The fog seemed to stretch toward him, or maybe toward me. I stepped back. My foot crunched on gravel. He didn't flinch. He didn't shift. But the feeling of being watched deepened, sinking into my bones, pressing my chest with weight I couldn't name. I wanted to speak, but my mouth felt heavy. Words stuck. Silence stretched between us, vast, almost alive. The faint hum of the street lamp returned, flickering low. I caught the slightest movement. His outline was sharper now, though I had not moved and the fence had not bent. The shadows around him leaned, stretching, as though the night itself had recognized his presence. I tried to step sideways, away from the fence, but each movement felt sluggish, slow, like moving through water. The gravel underfoot shifted unnaturally, stones rolling where they should not have. I swallowed hard. The chill of the night bit at my fingers, but the fear was heavier than any cold. I realized that even the wind had stopped. Not a leaf stirred, not a twig cracked. A soft rasp of air brushed against my ear. I turned sharply. Nothing. Yet the figure had moved again. Closer. Not walking. Not running. Just there. The kind of movement that is too smooth, too impossible to belong to flesh. My chest tightened. Breath shallow, quick. I considered running. But the path seemed longer than it had moments before, and the dark grew deeper, thicker, pressing toward me. I forced my legs to move backward, away from the fence. The gravel underfoot cracked with each hesitant step. Each step echoed in the still night, loud and brittle. I dared a glance back. He was there, closer. No outline now, only shadow pressed into shadow. A form that shouldn't exist this close without sound or space. The street lamp flickered one last time. The trees behind him, behind me, blurred, as though bending toward some unseen rhythm. I couldn't tell if I was moving forward or the forest was bending around me, and then the light went out completely. Darkness swallowed the trail. The fence was gone. The figure, gone. Or maybe it had only stepped into the shadows, leaving the night holding its shape. The silence that followed was thick, heavier than fog. Every nerve in my body screamed, and yet I could not make a sound. Even my own heartbeat felt loud, intruding on the quiet. I kept walking, careful, slow. Every shadow that moved along the edge of my vision made my skin crawl. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of fog, felt like a reminder that he had not left. He was waiting. I reached a bend in the trail. The forest behind me seemed impossibly still, as though it had exhaled and waited. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel him there. The weight of him. The impossibility of him. The path stretched on, unknown, and the night whispered around me, pressing closer, holding me in the quiet dread of the edge of the forest. I moved forward, but the memory of the figure lingered, pale and still, and I knew that somewhere beyond the fence, he was still there, waiting. The fog was thicker tonight, curling low over the trail. It smelled damp, earthy, faintly metallic, as if the forest itself had a pulse. Each step I took sank slightly into the wet ground, soft and uneven. A low hum followed me, almost imperceptible at first. I paused, listening. The sound didn't come from the trees or the earth. It was in the air, carried on the fog itself. I pulled out my phone. The screen flickered, cracked with tiny lines of static. My reflection appeared, distorted, twisted in the glass. Eyes wider than mine, features shifting, not quite human. I dropped the phone, catching it just before it hit the ground. The hum grew louder, a vibration under my skin. Soft words began to thread through it, almost whispers. They weren't clear, just syllables that brushed against my consciousness. I raised the phone again. The static moved differently this time, shapes forming and unforming. A face appeared, my face, but wrong. Longer, thinner, eyes empty and unblinking. I turned away, heart hammering, but the hum and whispers followed. The fog pressed closer, damp against my cheeks, curling around my shoulders. Every step felt heavier. Every sound, my own breath, the rustle of leaves, was mirrored by the low static, as if the night had learned to imitate me. I tried to speak, to call out, but the words were swallowed, returned to me in fragments, twisted, alien, too close. It was not echoing, it was responding. I stumbled forward, branches brushing my arms, wet and cold. The fog wrapped around my legs, slowed my steps. The humming grew into a rhythm, pulsing in time with my heartbeat, or maybe shaping my heartbeat to its own tempo. I glanced at the phone again. The screen blinked black, then flickered, revealing shapes moving beneath the surface, hands pressed to glass, faces staring up at me. Not mine. Something else. The whispers turned almost coherent. Don't look back. Follow. Or maybe that was my own fear speaking, twisted into sound by the static, by the fog, by the forest that was listening. I shook my head, trying to clear it. The mist clung to my hair, soaked my clothes, and the low hum seemed to vibrate through the soles of my shoes. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but my legs felt heavy, slow, uncooperative. A sudden flicker on the phone drew my gaze. My reflection blinked, not me. The eyes in the glass were wider, darker, staring from a place I did not recognize. I turned sharply. The fog moved with me, curling, shifting, but nothing else appeared. I wanted to throw the phone, break it, anything to stop the whispers. But even as I dropped it, the sound lingered. Soft, pervasive, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I forced my feet forward. Branches clawed at my sleeves, the air pressed damp and cold against my skin. Every shadow seemed to thicken as I moved, folding inward, hiding shapes just beyond sight. The whispers sharpened, almost mocking, like the forest had learned the shape of my fear. The static pulsed, low and steady, vibrating under my feet, through my hands, through my chest. I stopped, clutching my phone, breath shallow, skin prickling. The words whispered louder, closer, urgent. You shouldn't have checked. I dropped the phone. The hum continued, soft, endless, and the fog pressed against me, damp and tight. Wrapping around my shoulders like hands I could not shake. I kept walking, slow, careful, but every step carried the memory of static, the flickering, the whispers, the shapes in the glass that were not mine. By the time I reached the edge of the fog, my hands still trembled, my chest still tight with unease. The forest had not moved. The whispers lingered, soft as breath, reminding me that I had seen what should never be seen. And I knew. I would never check my reflection in the fog again. The trail curved sharply, the fog thick and cold around me. Branches dripped with moisture, brushing my shoulders as I walked. Night pressed in, heavier here, almost solid. I saw it then, an old wooden rest stop leaning slightly to one side. Its roof sagged, shingles missing, wood weathered to gray. I paused, the quiet pressing my ears. The forest seemed to hold its breath. No wind stirred, no leaves rustled. Just the soft hum of my own footsteps on damp soil. I stepped inside. The smell of old wood, rot, and rain hit me immediately. The beams were carved, spirals, circles, eyes, etched deep and careful. I traced a finger along one, cold and rough. In the corner, words scratched into the wall caught my eye. Don't sit here at night. I stared at them, the letters uneven but deliberate. The silence thickened, as if the building itself were listening. I ran my hands along the walls. The carvings seemed to twist under my touch, shadows pooling in the grooves. A single floorboard creaked beneath my weight. Then silence again. The forest outside pressed close, fog curling under the eaves. The rest stop felt smaller, yet larger, stretching into corners I could not see. Every sound, my breath, my heartbeat felt magnified. Every shadow moved slightly when I wasn't looking. I tried to sit, but my knees wouldn't bend. The words in the corner seemed to sink deeper into my vision. The carvings stared back at me, faces forming in spirals and circles. Eyes wide, mouths frozen mid-scream, a soft hum began, low, almost imperceptible. I froze, listening. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the wood itself, from the walls, from the floor. I stepped backward. The hum grew, a vibration that traveled through my shoes, up my legs. The fog pressed at the open doorway, curling tendrils into the shelter. I could feel it brushing my arms, pulling at my hair. Every instinct told me to leave. Every step I took toward the door felt heavier, reluctant. I glanced back at the corner. The words, they seemed to move. Not the letters themselves, but the shadows beneath them, stretching like fingers. I held my breath. The forest outside remained still. The carvings on the walls seemed alive. The eyes watched, unblinking, patient. I forced myself forward, the floorboard creaking under each careful step. The smell of damp wood and earth followed me, clinging to my jacket and hair. The hum faded slightly, retreating into the corners of the room. But the silence remained, heavy, waiting. I stepped outside into the fog. The night swallowed the rest stop instantly. Branches scraped my face, the trail gone beneath mist. The carvings, the words, the hum. They lingered in my mind, as if the shelter had breathed itself into me. The forest felt different now, thicker, watching. The fog pressed closer, hugging my ankles and creeping higher. I tried to shake the memory of the carvings, but the spiral eyes followed me in every shadow. I moved forward, slow, careful. The night stretched ahead, indistinct, endless. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, my own breath, felt amplified, as if the forest itself were holding a secret I was not meant to know. I glanced back once. The rest stop sat silent, gray and leaning, its door open, inviting, patient, but empty. And yet I felt it. The hum beneath the wood, the carved eyes, the whispering stillness. I kept walking. The fog swallowed me, trail and shelter alike. The night pressed close, and the memory of the old rest stop remained, alive in the quiet, watching. The ridge rose above the trail, shrouded in fog and shadow. Branches reached out skeletal and wet, brushing my jacket. Night air pressed against my face, cold, damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and pine. I paused, catching my breath. A figure stood at the edge of the ridge, pale, unmoving, watching. It didn't step forward. It didn't move at all, just lingered, tall and silent, a shape carved out of the mist. I swallowed, heart tight in my chest. The forest around me was impossibly still. No wind stirred, no leaves rustled, only the quiet weight of being observed. I tried to look away, tried to convince myself it was a trick of the fog, but each time I glanced back, it was closer, closer than it should have been. The ridge had not changed. The path had not moved. I started forward, slow, careful. Branches scraped wet across my arms. The earth smelled of moss and decay. Each footstep seemed louder than it should, yet it did not startle the watcher. I ran for a moment, legs pumping, lungs burning. The figure didn't move. It simply waited, pale against the ridge, a silent presence that stretched the night. When I reached safety, lower, away from the ridge, it was already there, waiting where I had begun, as though it had moved through the fog without making a sound. My chest tightened. Breath caught in my throat. The air was thick with mist, each inhale wet and cold. I wanted to speak, to call out, but my voice caught, swallowed by the night. Every sound seemed amplified, my heartbeat, my breath, and yet stillness pressed heavier around me. I stepped backward, cautiously. The ground was soft with damp leaves crunching faintly beneath my shoes. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs were heavy, reluctant, as if the fog itself weighed them down. I glanced up at the ridge. The figure had not moved. Its pale face, or pale suggestion of a face, was fixed, patient, watching, waiting. I forced myself to turn away, forward, down the trail. Branches scraped again, fog curling around my ankles. Every shadow along the path seemed longer, stretching toward me, shapes bending like the forest itself were leaning closer. I stopped. The figure had not followed. Yet the sense of being watched remained, pressing on my back, under my skin, a presence too patient, too quiet, to dismiss. I ran again, slower this time, careful not to trip on roots slick with damp. Each breath came ragged, shallow, and yet I could feel it, impossibly close, the pale watcher waiting at the ridge, silent, unblinking. I glanced back once more. The fog shifted slightly, and for a brief instant I thought it had leaned forward. But perhaps it was only my imagination, a trick of the fog and my own exhaustion. Every step I took, every move I made felt measured against its presence. Even though it did not follow, it was already there, where I had been, waiting for me to arrive. The forest pressed around me, dense, patient. Branches drooped low, fog curling through their tips. The night smelled of wet earth and pine resin, a dampness that clung to my hair and jacket, mixing with the weight of fear. I kept walking, careful, slow, my eyes constantly drawn to the ridge. The pale watcher remained, unchanging, patient, a shape carved into the mist itself. I realized exhaustion was settling in. Every muscle ached, every nerve was raw with tension. But the awareness of its presence made rest impossible. Even in safety it waited, silent, patient, unyielding. The path wound lower, fog curling over stones and roots. The ridge faded behind me, but the memory of pale eyes lingered, embedded in the quiet night, a patient witness to my every step. I did not look back again. I could feel it still, in the stretch of fog, in the hush of the forest, in the patient, unblinking silence that followed me long after the ridge disappeared from view, and somewhere deep in the fog, I knew. It had not moved. It had not left. It was still waiting. The forest was impossibly still. No wind stirred the branches. No birds called. Even the fog seemed to hang motionless between the trees. I walked slowly, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. Every step sounded too loud, echoing strangely in the quiet. Then it began. The leaves. A soft rustling, brushing together in waves. No wind moved them. No hand stirred the branches. The sound circled me, curling around my legs and waist, brushing past my ears. I froze. The rustling paused. A heartbeat of silence. Then it started again, closer this time. I stepped forward, careful. Leaves swirled in slow spirals around my boots. The sound grew, layered, filling the space between the trees. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating under my ribs. The fog pressed against my arms, wet and cold, wrapping me in a damp embrace. The leaves rustled in patterns I could not follow. Like the forest itself was breathing around me, curling closer, observing. I whispered into the dark. No reply. But the rustling moved faster, circling, softly, deliberately, waiting for something I could not name. Branches scraped my shoulders. The forest smelled of wet moss and earth, but there was a hint of something else, metallic, sharp, unplaceable. I stepped backward. The rustling followed, turning, curling in perfect rhythm with my steps. I tried to run, but the leaves moved faster, spinning around me. The sound filled my ears, drowning out my own breath. I could not tell where I ended, and the rustling began. The fog thickened. I could barely see the path ahead. The forest seemed to lean inward, holding me, folding in on itself, waiting. I stopped completely. The rustling slowed, fading into nothing. My breath came ragged, ears ringing from the sudden quiet. The forest waited, patient, watching. I dared a glance around. Shadows pooled in the corners of the trees. The leaves hung still, as though frozen mid-wave. The silence was sharp, suffocating, the kind that presses into your chest, leaving every nerve raw and alert. I moved forward again, cautiously. Branches tapped my jacket like fingernails, and the forest smelled of wet pine and decay. The fog wrapped higher around my legs, but the rustling had stopped, replaced by a heavy, waiting quiet. Each step seemed measured, echoing against the hush, my own breath too loud in the stillness. I could feel the forest around me, alive in its patient silence. A twig cracked behind me. I spun. Nothing moved. The leaves had returned to their unnatural stillness, but the weight of being watched pressed into my shoulders. I whispered again, barely audible. No reply. Only the forest, waiting, holding its breath. The mist swirled around my ankles, wet and clinging. Every shadow stretched, bending toward me, but no figure appeared. Just the rustling memory in my mind, echoing as though the forest remembered every sound, every step, every moment I had moved. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was the wind, the shape of the trees, but my chest tightened. My legs refused to move faster. The forest waited for something, and I knew it wasn't the wind it was listening for. The trail narrowed. Fog swallowed the edges. Branches pressed in tighter, and the silence thickened, dense and patient, almost alive. I stepped forward, slow, careful. The rustling had stopped entirely. The forest had paused. Even the fog held itself in suspension, and then I realized the quiet was not empty. It was listening, waiting, patient, for the next sound. I walked on, boots soft against damp earth, breath shallow, nerves taut. The forest followed in its stillness, leaning closer with every step. And the memory of rustling leaves lingered, as though the night itself was breathing around me, holding me in its quiet, and I could not escape. The hill rose quietly before me, its slope soft under the fog. Branches drooped low, heavy with moisture, brushing my hair and shoulders. The night smelled of damp earth and iron, sharp and metallic in the cold air. I stumbled over a root and froze. There it was, a tunnel hidden in the hillside. Concrete, crumbling, gray, almost swallowed by moss and shadow. A faint light flickered inside, not warm, not welcoming. Just a candle or something like it, shivering against the walls. I paused at the mouth of the tunnel. The air was cooler here, pressing against my face, damp and still. I could smell earth, cold stone, and the faint tang of something deeper, older. I stepped forward. The ground beneath me was rough, uneven, stones slick with moisture catching my boots. The light ahead flickered, hesitant, like it didn't want me to come closer. The walls were cracked, concrete peeling in streaks. A soft, low hum vibrated through the tunnel, carrying the scent of damp earth into my chest. I could feel it through my bones, low and steady, pressing a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Shadows stretched along the walls. Each step I took made them bend and twist in impossible ways, turning the tunnel into a corridor of shapes that should not exist. I raised my hand to touch the wall. Cold stone, rough, wet with condensation. The candlelight flickered again, and for a brief moment I thought I saw my own shadow. It was wrong. Too long, too thin. It stretched along the wall, frozen in a stance I had not taken. I blinked. It hadn't moved, but I knew I hadn't made that shape. The hum grew slightly louder, vibrating beneath my feet. The air smelled colder now, like ice and iron, pressing into my lungs. The candlelight ahead flickered again, and the shadow remained. I stepped forward. Each movement echoed softly, swallowed by the damp walls. The tunnel seemed longer than it should, stretching impossibly into darkness and fog. The light flickered, and the shadow on the wall shifted. Not with me, not like a reflection. It waited. Patient, still impossible. I swallowed, heart hammering. My breath caught in the damp air, and the chill pressed along my neck and shoulders. I wanted to step back, but the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly behind me, as though the forest outside had vanished. The flicker of candlelight grew stronger, pulling me deeper. The hum became a whisper, soft, threaded through the fog of the tunnel. Words, shapes of words, not fully formed, brushed the edges of my mind. I could almost hear my name, slow, deliberate, lingering in the damp air. I stepped closer to the light. The shadow on the far wall stretched longer, and then I saw it, not moving toward me, not moving at all. My own shadow stood there, frozen against the concrete. Its arms hung at impossible angles. Its head tilted slightly like it was waiting, watching me approach, knowing I would. I swallowed hard. The candlelight trembled, revealing a faint outline of something else in the corner of my vision. I turned, and nothing was there. Yet the feeling remained, cold, heavy, patient. The hum grew louder, vibrating in my chest, pressing against my ears, against my bones. I could feel the shadow waiting for me to move, for me to breathe, for me to falter. I tried to step back. The ground underfoot felt softer, almost alive. The tunnel seemed to stretch farther behind me than before. The candle flickered, shivering against the wall, and I realized I had followed the light into something I could not leave behind. I forced my legs to move, one careful step at a time. The shadow did not move. It waited, patient. Every inhale brought the smell of damp stone and iron deeper. Every step echoed softly, swallowed by fog. The tunnel pressed closer, wrapping me in silence and cold. I turned my head slightly. The shadow, my shadow, remained on the far wall. It waited where I had not been, holding a shape I had not made, patiently, impossibly still. I wanted to run. I wanted to flee back into the forest, to leave the tunnel, the light, the shadow behind. But the fog inside had thickened. The walls pressed inward and the shadow waited. I kept moving forward, drawn by the flicker, even as my chest burned with fear, even as my breath came ragged and cold. The tunnel seemed endless, the shadow waiting, and I knew it had been here before I arrived, and it would be here long after I left. The pines rose taller here, their trunks black against the foggy night. No wind stirred the needles. No birds called. The forest was unnaturally still, holding its breath. I walked slowly along the trail. The ground was soft with pine needles, damp and springy beneath my boots. Every step pressed me deeper into quiet, each inhale cold and wet in my lungs. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft, threading through the branches above. I paused. The fog curled around me, wrapping my ankles, pressing damp against my legs. The whisper came again, my name, slow, drawn out. Not from any single direction, but all around me, rising through the fog, twisting between trunks and branches. I pressed my hands to my ears, heart hammering, trying to shut it out. But the sound came from inside, a voice that belonged to the night, or perhaps to me. The forest leaned closer, shadows pooling along the roots. The pines loomed tall, indifferent, yet attentive. Every branch seemed to stretch toward me, rustling faintly. Though no wind existed, I whispered back, voice tight and trembling. Nothing returned, except the echo of my own words, slightly warped, slightly closer than it should have been. The fog thickened, curling around my shoulders, soaking my jacket. Each breath felt wet and heavy. The needles underfoot whispered, shifting subtly with each step. I could feel the forest listening, patient, as though it had memorized every sound I had made. I moved forward cautiously, careful not to make too much noise. The whispers followed. Soft syllables I could almost understand, like fragments of sentences from a language I had forgotten. They lingered in my mind, curling around my thoughts. I glanced up. The pines stretched endlessly, their trunks black and silent, yet vibrating faintly in the hush. The fog clung to their bases, pooling like pale water. And the whispers came again, this time overlapping, multiple voices, threading through the branches in a pattern I could not follow. I pressed onward, boots soft on the needles, fingers brushing wet bark for balance. The air smelled of pine sap, earth, and something faintly metallic like iron left in a pool of water. I stopped. The whispers circled, lingering, patient, slowing and speeding in waves that made my skin prickle. The forest pressed closer, silent now, and I could feel its attention, heavy and deliberate. I turned slightly, but the fog swallowed everything behind me. Shadows pooled at the bases of the trees, dark, endless, and unmoving. The whispers grew softer, gentler, but no less insistent. I pressed on again. The trail twisted, narrow and uneven. Each step pressed me deeper into the pines, into the fog, into the echo of voices that were not mine, yet knew my name. I whispered once more, trying to anchor myself, trying to tell myself I was alone. But the words returned to me, shaped differently, closer, echoing from somewhere just beyond sight, inside the fog, inside the trees, inside me. The night felt infinite. Every step, every breath, every rustle of needles was a reminder that the forest had not released me. It held me in the rhythm of its whispers, patient, deliberate, unyielding. The fog wrapped my shoulders tight. I could hear my heartbeat in every branch, my breath threading through every needle above. The whispers followed, soft as a lullaby, but impossibly wrong. I pressed forward until the trail curved, the pines thinning slightly, and I realized I had been walking for longer than I should have. The voices faded, lingering only in my mind, soft echoes threading through my thoughts, and yet I knew they had not stopped. Somewhere, inside the forest, inside the fog, inside the night itself, they were still whispering my name. The forest thickened as I walked deeper, shadows folding between the trunks. The fog clung to the ground, curling around roots and stones. The air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly of rot, though no fallen leaves were close enough to blame. I noticed it then, a wooden cabin. At first I thought it was a trick of the fog, but as I stepped closer, I saw it was real. No door, no windows. Just walls, tall and still, standing alone in the clearing. I circled the cabin slowly. The fog shifted at the edges of my vision, curling into shapes that disappeared when I blinked. Each angle revealed the same thing. Walls, solid, silent, unyielding, the cabin seemed almost alive. A faint hum vibrated through the air, low and persistent. It wasn't loud enough to be heard from a distance, but close. It pressed against my chest, a vibration I could feel in my bones. I stepped back to consider it. The clearing around the cabin was empty, but the forest leaned closer, branches drooping as if to watch. The fog swirled in the corners of my vision, hiding shapes I didn't want to see. I tried to touch the cabin, but the wood was smooth and cold, unexpectedly alive under my fingers. The hum grew slightly stronger, a vibration that threaded through my arms, my chest, my spine. I circled once more. The cabin seemed to shift subtly as I moved. I wasn't sure if the angle had changed or if it had turned slightly toward me. A faint, imperceptible motion, but enough to make my skin prickle. The forest held its breath. Even the fog seemed to pause, curling in place, clinging close to my ankles and legs. The faint hum continued, low, steady, pressing, alive in a way I could not name. I knelt briefly, touching the moss at the base of the cabin. Cold, damp, yet pulsing faintly beneath my hands. The wood seemed to resonate with it, responding, aware of my presence, patient, patient, patient. I stepped back. Branches scraped my jacket, the needles wet against my face. The clearing stretched silently around me, but the hum seemed to follow, shifting as I moved. A vibration threading through the fog, through the air, through the night itself. I pressed my hand to the wall again. It felt warmer in one spot, cooler in another. The hum had a rhythm now, subtle like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. I realized then that the cabin was not simply standing here. It was aware, watching. I took a step back, afraid to move too quickly. The fog curled higher, tight around my ankles, wet against my skin. Every shadow at the edge of the clearing seemed to stretch slightly, leaning closer, like the forest itself was converging on this place. I walked slowly around once more. The cabin remained still and silent, but the subtle shift continued. A faint movement I couldn't ignore. It was alive. Not in the way wood or stone is alive, but aware, patient, breathing softly beneath the fog. The hum grew slightly, vibrating through my chest. I realized my own heartbeat was echoing in time with it. A calm dread settled over me, soft and persistent, like the fog itself had wrapped around my shoulders. I stepped back into the trees. The clearing seemed larger now, yet the cabin remained close, its walls unyielding, solid and slightly turned toward me. The hum followed, low and steady, threading through the fog, pressing close to my chest, a presence I could not leave behind. I paused. Branches scraped my hair, damp against my skin. The forest waited, patient. The fog pressed tight, curling around my boots. And the cabin remained, silent, humming, alive in its quiet way, watching patiently. I moved forward slowly, careful, my steps soft on wet earth. The fog clung, the forest leaned, but the cabin stayed behind me, hum vibrating faintly in my memory. Even as the trail swallowed me back into the trees, I could feel it, alive, watching, waiting, and I knew. I had seen only a fraction of its quiet presence. The fog thickened as I walked. Branches pressed close, wet and cold against my arms. Every step on the trail sounded softer than it should, swallowed by the hush of night. I raised my flashlight. Its beam cut a narrow path through the mist, illuminating long shadows stretching across the trail. But something was wrong. The shapes didn't match the trees. They bent strangely, warped, twisting toward me in ways that made my skin prickle. I stopped. The shadows paused, too. Every time I moved, they adjusted, curling and leaning. It was as if they were alive, observing, waiting. I whispered quietly, "Hello." My words returned immediately, but not quite my voice. Distorted, closer, echoing from somewhere beyond the light. The fog pressed tighter around me. The shadows stretched longer, bending further, and I realized they were independent of the trees entirely. Some reached toward me, slow, deliberate, patient. I turned the flashlight in a wide circle. Nothing but mist, trees, and those shapes. Long, black, impossible, stretching and bending. Then I blinked. Some had moved closer. No wind, no sound, just shape and darkness. I dropped my gaze. The beam trembled in my hands. Even when I turned it off, the shapes didn't vanish. The darkness itself had weight, and it was not empty. I took a careful step back. Branches scraped my face and shoulders. The fog curled in coils around my ankles. The shapes shifted slightly, leaning toward me, and the hush of night pressed against my chest. I whispered again. "Who's there?" Nothing. Only the weight of watching, patient, and a sense that the shadows remembered my steps. I stepped forward, careful. The shapes mirrored me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. The trail curved, narrow now, and the fog swallowed the edges. I could barely see my own boots. Yet the shapes followed. Every movement echoed too loudly, yet too softly, too subtle, as if the fog itself had learned to reflect fear. The shadows leaned closer, bending and pooling in corners, but there was no sound beyond my heartbeat. I stopped completely. The beam of the flashlight trembled against my chest. The shadows stretched, folded, and I realized the darkness itself had form. Not trees, not rocks, but shapes that did not belong. I dared to glance behind me. The fog swallowed the trail. Nothing. And yet, the feeling of presence remained. Heavy, patient, unblinking. I moved again. Slow, careful, boots pressing damp soil. The shapes bent, leaning toward me, folding the fog around themselves. A presence that followed every step, silent and unyielding. I whispered one last time. No answer, only the stillness of shapes that remembered, shapes that waited. I could feel them press closer, leaning into my spine, into the fog, into the night. I kept moving, slow, deliberate. The trail stretched on, narrow, swallowed by fog. Branches scraped, leaves rustled faintly, but the shadows had already folded themselves into the darkness, waiting for the next step. The fog pressed against me, damp and tight. I could feel the shapes everywhere, not quite seen, not quite gone. The night had learned to bend, to stretch, to shape itself around my fear. And even as I finally slipped beyond that section of trail, the shadows remained. Not behind me, not ahead, but with me inside the darkness, inside the hush, inside the fog itself. The trail narrowed, wrapped tight with fog. Branches brushed my shoulders, dripping moisture onto my jacket. The earth smelled damp, sharp, like iron and pine mixed together. I noticed it then, a wooden post, leaning slightly to one side. Weathered and gray, its surface rough beneath my fingers. Letters were carved deep into the wood. But the name, it wasn't one I recognized. I traced the letters carefully. The edges were worn smooth by rain and years, but still deliberate, intentional. A chill ran up my arm, settling into my chest. The forest pressed closer. Fog wrapped my legs, curling up my calves. Every sound, my breath, my heartbeat felt amplified. The trail behind me seemed to disappear. The silence held me. I glanced down. Footprints led away from the marker, deeper into the forest. Bare, human, fresh, waiting. I hesitated. Each step toward them made the hairs on my arms rise. The fog pressed closer with every move, as if the forest itself were leaning in to watch. I stepped forward. The prints pressed in the mud, too clean, too deliberate to be a trick of the weather. They curved along the trail, winding through roots and stones. Every footstep was heavy, but there was no sound beyond my own. The fog thickened. Branches curled around the edges of my vision. I could feel eyes, countless unseen, watching from the mist. The footprints seemed to lead farther than they should, deeper into a forest that was silent, waiting. I traced one with my finger. The mud was cold, squishy under my touch, but something about it felt wrong. Not just the size, the way the earth pressed against it, as if it remembered the weight of the step. I drew back my hand, heart hammering. The silence pressed close, almost tactile. Every nerve in my body screamed, and yet I could not look away. The footprints continued ahead. They stopped suddenly, mid-step, as though whatever had made them had vanished into the fog. The trail stretched forward, empty and waiting. I swallowed. The letters on the post seemed sharper now, almost glowing faintly in the moonlight. A message, warning, invitation, all at once. The forest seemed alive, patient, holding its breath for the next move. I felt a presence behind me, not human but deliberate, a weight in the fog, a vibration underfoot. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I took a careful step forward. The footprints led into the mist, deeper, darker. Every branch scraped my jacket. Every step echoed strangely in the hush of the forest. I whispered softly. Nothing. Only the faint shifting of fog around me. The heavy, patient stillness of the trees. The trail marker loomed behind me, its carved letters now seeming alive in the moonlight. The footprints ahead held a promise, silent, waiting, patient. Something had moved through them and could move again at any moment. I kept moving, step by careful step, following the bare prints into the fog. The forest seemed to stretch, bending, curling around me. The trail narrowed, roots snagging boots, branches brushing face and hair. The fog pressed tighter, damp and heavy, and the footprints remained fresh, deliberate, waiting. I glanced back once. The post leaned silent and gray, its letters etched into memory, unchanging. The forest seemed to sigh, holding its patience, its quiet expectation. I pressed forward, boots soft against wet earth, heart tight, lungs burning. The footprints wound deeper into fog, and I knew I was not alone. Whatever had left them had paused, waiting. The forest closed around me. Branches curled, roots caught at my steps. The fog wrapped higher, thicker, and I realized I could not leave the trail behind. It was alive in the quiet, patient, and it remembered every step I had taken. I moved forward, careful, deliberate. The footprints led on, and the forest waited, silent, patient, unyielding. The forest floor was uneven, roots twisting beneath my boots. Fog curled around my ankles, cold and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and moss. The trail narrowed, swallowed by trees, and I stumbled over something hard. Glass, flat, smooth, embedded in the ground, like windows laid into the soil, covering something beneath. I knelt slowly, careful not to startle whatever might be below. The glass was cold, wet with condensation. Through it I could see faint shapes, dim candlelight flickering in tiny rooms. The rooms were miniature, impossible. Furniture too small, candles too delicate, yet the light felt alive, pulsing faintly, breathing under the fog. I pressed my forehead to the glass. The air smelled of damp earth and wax, heavy and sharp. I could see shadows moving, slow, deliberate, though I could not tell how they moved. Then, movement. A figure looked up. Not tiny like the room, but human, watching. Their eyes met mine through the glass, wide and pale, unblinking. I froze. The fog seemed to curl tighter around my legs, pressing damp and cold. The forest was silent, holding its breath. The figure didn't move again, just waited, patient and impossible, mirrored in the faint glow of candlelight. I traced the edge of the glass with my hand, cold, smooth, unyielding. The reflection above showed my own face, pale and tense. Yet when I looked into the miniature room, the figure below did not match me. A soft tapping echoed inside the glass, faint, almost imperceptible, like fingers brushing against wood. I stepped back, heart hammering, breath thick in my chest. The fog pressed closer, curling around my ankles and waist. The air smelled sharper now, iron and damp soil blending, and I felt a presence behind me, patient, deliberate. I dared not turn. The figure below remained, watching, human, pale, Impossible. I whispered softly, testing the air. No reply. Only the hum of fog, the faint pulse of candlelight, and the strange, mirrored sensation that I was being observed from both above and below. I knelt again, compelled despite fear. The figure's eyes followed me with impossible patience. I traced the edges of the glass, cold beneath my fingers, fingernails leaving wet streaks. The rooms inside shifted subtly, shadows stretching and folding in ways that made no sense. A tiny chair moved. A candle flickered higher, though no wind existed. I took a cautious step back. The fog wrapped closer, pressing damp against my arms. Branches scratched at my hair, the ground soft beneath my boots. Every nerve in my body tensed, expecting movement where none should exist. And then, another movement. A hand pressed upward from beneath the glass. Pale, thin, deliberate. It pressed against the surface like it could feel my touch, like it was testing the boundary between our worlds. I jumped back. The forest seemed to lean closer, fog curling tight, pressing damp and heavy. The figure in the room looked up again, unblinking, watching, patient. I swallowed. My reflection above moved, but the figure below remained still, waiting, a mirrored dread beneath the glass. The candlelight flickered one last time, and I realized I could not tear my eyes away. The figure was not tiny. It was impossible. Alive in some way, trapped beneath the forest floor, yet aware of me, waiting for me to move, to breathe, to falter. I stood slowly, careful, keeping my gaze on the glass. The fog pressed around me, branches curling like fingers. The forest waited, patient, while the figure below remained, pale eyes fixed on mine. I stepped away, boots soft against wet needles. The fog seemed to follow my legs, curling higher, tighter, as though the forest itself remembered what I had seen. And still, through the glass in the ground, the pale eyes waited, patient, watching. The crossroads appeared slowly through the fog, trees thinning just enough to reveal a clearing. The air was damp, cold, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. Branches curled above me, scraping the misty sky. There it stood, an iron signpost leaning slightly to one side. Rust marked its surface, rough and sharp under my fingers. In the dim light, the letters were unreadable, twisted by age and weather. I stepped closer. The fog clung to my ankles, curling damp and cold around my boots. The air pressed in on me, heavy, patient, waiting. I traced the iron with a finger. Under moonlight, the letters shifted. Shapes I recognized, words I knew. Softly, impossibly, the sign whispered, "Follow. This way." I stepped back, heart hammering. The fog swirled, pressing tighter around me. Every sound, my breath, the scrape of my boots on wet earth, echoed strangely, swallowed by the hush of night. I leaned closer again. The letters on the post seemed to bend, turn, forming directions I could read, but did not understand fully. Every option pulled me deeper, every path promising something I could not name. A low hum ran through the air, subtle, almost imperceptible, pressing against my chest, curling around my ribs. The forest seemed to lean closer, trees bending toward the crossroads. Branches tapped lightly, rhythmical, deliberate, like fingers drumming against unseen walls. I whispered softly, testing the air. "Which way?" The fog swallowed my words. The signpost shivered faintly. The letters rearranged themselves under the moonlight. Soft, deliberate, urging me forward, I reached out, hand trembling, touching the cool, rusted iron. The sign vibrated slightly beneath my fingers. A faint pressure that pressed into my palm, and I felt the pull of the paths before me. Each way led only deeper. Not forward, not home, but further into the forest, into fog, into waiting. The air smelled sharper now, metallic and wet, like iron left in rain. The fog wrapped higher, thick and soft, pressing against my chest, damp fingers curling around my jacket sleeves. I stepped back. The forest seemed to stretch, branches leaning, fog curling, the signpost bending subtly toward me. The whispering grew faintly louder, a low, soft insistence threading through the mist. I turned slowly, peering down each path. Fog swallowed the trails quickly, curled around roots and stones like a living thing, patient and deliberate. The whispers followed me, softly urging, gently coaxing, threading through the mist and underbrush. I felt my heartbeat in my ears. The forest waited. The crossroads waited. Even the fog seemed deliberate now, curling higher, wrapping closer, holding me in place, asking me to choose. I traced the iron again. The letters shimmered faintly under moonlight. I could almost hear them, soft syllables brushing my mind. Follow. Deeper. Follow. Further. I swallowed. The forest pressed in, branches brushing my hair, needles cold against my skin, fog damp against my legs, and every step forward seemed to echo endlessly, swallowed by quiet. I stepped slowly, carefully letting the fog guide my boots. The signpost hummed faintly, low and insistent, pressing into my palm, my chest, pulling me toward paths I could not name, paths that led only deeper, into the waiting dark of the forest. I realized then that the crossroads was not just a place. It was alive in its own way, aware of every step I took, every breath I drew, every decision I delayed. The forest and the fog leaned closer, and the sign whispered my name softly, threaded through the mist, through the trees, through the night itself. I moved forward, careful, deliberate. Every path ahead seemed endless. Every choice carried weight. The signpost stood silent behind me, but alive, patient, its letters shimmering faintly, waiting for the next step. And as the fog swallowed me deeper into the forest, I knew the crossroads would remember me. The whispering would follow, soft, insistent, patient. Every trail led only further. The fog pressed close as I walked. It clung to my ankles, curling damp and cold around my boots. Every step sank slightly into the soft, wet earth. Branches scraped my jacket, brushing hair across my face. Then I felt it, warm breath against my neck. Not a draft, not the wind. A presence, close, too close. I froze. My skin prickled, goosebumps rising along my arms. The fog pressed tighter, curling higher, damp and heavy. I dared not turn. Step by careful step, I moved forward. The breath followed. Steady, patient, lingering. Sometimes slow, almost gentle, sometimes quickening with my heartbeat. I whispered softly. No reply, only the fog and the damp hush of the forest. Yet I knew there was someone, something behind me. I turned my head just slightly. Nothing. The trail stretched ahead, swallowed by fog. The forest leaned closer, branches drooping, the fog curling around my legs, ankles, waist. I kept moving. Every inhale pressed the scent of wet earth and pine deeper into my lungs. Every step echoed softly, swallowed by the fog. And the breath remained. I stopped. So did it. Every instinct screamed to run. But the forest felt alive, patient, watching me, pressing closer. I whispered again. Only my own voice returned. Warped, faint, impossibly close, like an echo from somewhere inside the fog itself. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Nothing visible. Yet I could feel it there, matching my movements, mirroring my steps, just out of reach, patient, deliberate. The fog thickened, rising to my knees, curling around roots and stones. Every step forward seemed to echo endlessly. Every sound, my boots, my breath, the scrape of branches pressed against my ears, yet there was silence beyond it, heavy, impossible, attentive. I whispered my own name. It came back immediately, distorted, closer than it should be, threading along the back of my neck. The warmth returned, not wind, not human. I tried to run. My boots sank into wet earth. Roots snared my ankles. The fog tugged, curling higher, tighter, pressing, holding. I turned fully, still nothing. Yet I could feel it, the breath, warm, patient, deliberate, lingering just behind me. Step by step, I moved forward again. Every nerve taut, every breath shallow. The fog pressed closer, damp fingers wrapping tight. The forest leaned, branches scraping hair and shoulders. The presence followed, matching each movement. I stopped once more. The warmth brushed my neck again. A heartbeat behind my own, slow, patient, not mine. and yet it echoed with me. I whispered, low and careful. No reply. Only the fog, the forest, the damp hush pressing against my chest, and the breath, always there. I pressed forward, boots soft on wet earth, fog curling tighter around my legs, branches brushing my arms and face. Every inhale was damp, heavy, full of the scent of pine and earth. I dared to glance behind me one last time. Nothing visible. Yet I knew it was there, patient, deliberate, a presence that moved with me, inside the fog, inside the night, inside the hush itself. The forest seemed alive, breathing, watching, and I could not leave it behind. The warmth, the breath, the patient mirroring. It had become part of the air, part of the fog curling around me. Step by careful step, I moved forward. Every sound echoed endlessly, swallowed by the damp silence. The breath pressed close again, warm, patient, impossible. And even as I pressed deeper into the fog, I knew it would never leave. It would follow me. Always, patient, deliberate, pressing close behind, waiting in the silence of every step. Rain slicked the trail, turning the earth soft and slippery beneath my boots. Fog pressed low, curling around my ankles, thick and cold. Branches dripped onto my shoulders, wet needles scratching my neck. The mud held impressions, footprints, too large, too deep, dragging across the ground like claws had carved them. I stopped, staring down, heart hammering softly in the quiet. I traced one with my finger. Cold, wet earth pressed against my skin. The shape was wrong, unnatural. Heavy, deliberate, patient. Step by careful step, I followed them. The prints led deeper into the forest, where the fog hung thick and low, and the trees leaned close, shadows pooling at the bases. The air smelled of rain and earth, metallic and sharp. Every drip from overhead branches echoed softly, swallowed by the hush of night. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I glanced behind me. Nothing but fog and trees. Yet the prints had no origin I could see. No figure had passed, and still the impression stretched forward, dragging across the trail. The rain continued, soft, steady, pressing damp against my jacket. I followed the trail, boots sinking into mud, feeling the weight of the forest pressing close. Then, sudden stillness. The print stopped mid-step, claws dug into mud as if frozen, vanishing into nothing. I froze. The forest pressed close, silent, waiting. Even the fog seemed to hold its breath, curling tight around my ankles. No movement, no sound beyond my own shallow breathing, I whispered softly, testing the hush. Nothing replied. Only the damp, heavy fog curling higher, branches brushing my hair and shoulders. The prints loomed in my mind, a reminder of something impossible passing here, moving with patience, then vanishing as if it had never existed. I stepped closer, inspecting the last set. The claws had dug deep, uneven, deliberate. Cold mud pressed against my fingers when I knelt to touch it. A low vibration ran through the ground, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the forest itself remembered each step. I straightened slowly, boots soft against wet earth. The trail stretched forward, empty and waiting. Every step ahead felt heavier, slower, as if the forest resisted my movement, patient, deliberate, unyielding. I glanced around. Fog hung low, curling between trees, pressing tight. Shadows pooled at the bases of trunks, dark and still. Branches scraped lightly, deliberately, and I felt eyes unseen, patient, waiting, watching from the mist. The footprints were gone, yet their presence lingered in the mud, in the air, in the hush. Something had moved here. Something had stopped. And I could feel it, waiting just beyond sight. I whispered once more. Nothing. Only the rain, the dripping branches, the cold, soft hush of the forest pressing close. I took a careful step forward. Boots sank into wet earth. Roots snagged ankles. The trail curved into fog. I could feel the absence of the prints like a weight pressing into my chest. The forest seemed alive, breathing, patient, deliberate. The air pressed damp and heavy against my skin, and I knew whatever had made the tracks was still here, somewhere in the hush. I moved slowly, step by careful step, heart tight, breath shallow. The prints had vanished. Yet the stillness, the presence, the memory of movement followed me, pressing close, patient. Through the fog, through the trees, through every step, and the trail stretched onward, empty, waiting. The trail narrowed beneath the low-hanging branches. Fog curling around my boots, damp and heavy. Rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of wet earth and pine. Every step pressed soft into the moss-covered ground, every breath visible in the chill. Then I saw it. A small brass bell dangling from a branch above the trail. It swayed gently, though no wind moved it. Its surface glinted faintly in the pale light, reflecting the fog in distorted shapes. I stopped. The forest was silent, except for the soft, rhythmic chime of the bell trembling in the still air. Slow, deliberate, impossible. I stepped closer, boots wet against moss. The sound deepened, echoing softly through the fog. It lingered longer than it should, pressing against my chest, threading into my breath. I reached out. Fingers brushed the cold brass. The bell shivered beneath my touch, its sound stretching, echoing far into the forest. Then, another bell. Faint, deeper, farther along the trail. It rang soft, deliberate, impossibly slow. I could not see the branch, the tree, only the sound threading through the fog, calling, pulling, patient. I stepped back, heart hammering softly. The trail seemed to stretch longer, fog curling higher, pressing close to my legs, branches brushing hair and shoulders. The bells chimed again, each note deliberate, echoing into corners of the forest I could not see. I whispered softly. No reply, only the ringing, soft and impossible, pressing into my chest. I moved forward slowly. The first bell swayed slightly, then still as if waiting. The second bell trembled deeper, its sound threading through the trees, around the roots, under the fog. I tried to shake off the unease. The fog clung tighter, damp against my jacket, curling around my legs and ankles. The air pressed heavy, metallic, earthy. Every breath felt loud, echoing in the hush of the forest. The first bell chimed again, slow, deliberate, impossible. I reached out to touch it once more. The sound deepened, vibrated through the branch, the tree, the air, threading through the fog, pressing into my chest. Then, another sound, far deep, echoing from deeper in the forest. A second bell, somewhere unseen, ringing with a resonance that felt alive, deliberate, patient. I stepped forward, boots soft on wet moss. Branches scraped my hair, needles wet against my face. The fog pressed close, curling higher, and the forest itself seemed to lean toward the sound. I whispered my name, softly, carefully. The bells did not stop. They echoed through the fog, threading between the trunks, pressing closer, alive in their quiet, impossible way. I followed the sound, one bell after another, echoing, deepening, impossible. The air vibrated subtly, pressing into my chest, the fog curling like fingers around my legs. Every step forward was measured, careful. The first bell swayed again, then still. The second chimed softly, deliberate, deeper, pulling me further along the trail, deeper into the waiting forest. I dared to glance behind me. The first bell hung motionless, yet I could feel its presence. The lingering vibration pressing against the fog, against my chest, echoing through every nerve in my body. I whispered once more, softly, and the forest seemed to lean closer, fog curling higher, pressing damp against my jacket. Branches scraped gently, deliberately, and the bells chimed again, threading through the mist, patient, deliberate, alive. I moved on, boots soft on moss. The air smelled sharper now, metallic and wet. The fog pressed close, curling around my ankles, legs, waist. The sound of the bells followed, echoing far, farther than they could, impossible, deliberate, patient. And even as the trail stretched onward, and I pressed deeper into the fog, I knew the bells would follow. Slow, impossible, alive. Every step, every breath, threading through the forest, pressing close, waiting. The trail narrowed, twisting between tall trees. Fog pressed low, curling around my ankles, damp and cold. The forest smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and heavy. Every step sank softly into moss and fallen leaves. I noticed the first one, a knot in a tree, twisted, rough beneath my fingers. But as I stared, it shifted in my mind. Eyes, a mouth, frozen mid-scream. I stepped closer, careful. Branches brushed my hair, dripping with moisture. The fog curled tighter, heavy against my legs. More knots appeared, more faces, each twisted, each frozen, some human, some grotesque, impossible. I pressed my hands against one. Rough bark pressed cold into my skin. I could see a faint outline of lips, of a nose, of eyes, and it felt, aware, watching as I moved, I stepped back. The forest seemed to lean closer, branches drooping, fog curling around my ankles, waist. The faces multiplied, knot after knot, eyes tracking me silently, impossibly, I whispered softly. No reply. Only the hush of night, the damp weight of fog, and the faint rustle of leaves, though no wind existed. I walked slowly. The knots seemed to follow, stretching subtly, eyes unblinking, mouths frozen in silent screams. Each tree seemed older, heavier, deliberate, as if the forest had grown around something patient, watching me pass. I pressed my palm to a face again. Cold, rough, impossibly still. And then, I swear one of the eyes blinked. Slow, patient, a movement too human. Too deliberate, and I stumbled back, heart hammering softly. Breath shallow, branches scraped my shoulders, fog curling higher. The air smelled sharper, metallic, and damp. The trail beneath my boots twisted, uneven, and the faces seemed to stretch further along the path, more human, more deliberate, more impossible. I whispered again, carefully, almost silently. No sound returned except the faint, impossible weight of watching. Each knot, each face seemed to pulse subtly in the fog, breathing with the forest, alive in a way that pressed against my chest. Step by careful step, I moved forward. Boots soft against wet moss and leaves. Branches scraped hair and arms. The fog curled higher, pressing closer, damp and heavy. The faces multiplied, some larger, some smaller, all watching, waiting, patient. I dared to glance over my shoulder. The trail stretched into fog and the forest leaned closer. Pressing, but no shape followed, only the weight of eyes unseen. Tracking, unblinking. The faces in the bark shifted subtly, knots twisting into mouths and eyes that weren't quite the same, human in ways that made my stomach tighten. I could feel the forest's pulse through the roots beneath my boots, the fog pressing closer, the hush stretching heavier around me. I whispered my own name. It returned softly, distorted, threading through the trees, as though the forest repeated my voice, holding it, twisting it, waiting. I pressed on. Step by careful step, boots soft against wet earth. Branches scraped my face, fog curling around my ankles, and the faces followed, knot by knot, watching, blinking, impossible. The further I went, the more human they became, mouths slightly open, eyes tracking, aware. The forest seemed alive, patient, deliberate. Every tree, every knot, every shadow held attention. I stopped. The fog hung heavy, curling around my legs, pressing against my chest. I could feel the eyes of hundreds of knots, patient, deliberate, waiting. I whispered one last time. No answer. The forest waited. The fog pressed close. The faces in the bark stared silently, unblinking, alive, impossible. And as I moved forward again, I knew they would follow, patient and deliberate, watching from every tree, every knot, every shadow. The forest itself alive with impossible eyes. The trail narrowed beside a small stream. Fog pressed low, curling around my ankles, damp and cold. The forest smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and heavy. Branches drooped low, brushing my hair and shoulders. I stopped. The water should have flowed, soft and cold over smooth stones. But it was frozen, solid, glassy, unyielding. Even though it was summer, I knelt slowly beside it. The ice was hard, pale, smooth beneath my fingers. Faint cracks ran through it, like veins frozen in motion. cold pressed against my skin. Beneath the surface, something moved. Pale hands pressed upward from under the ice, thin fingers pressing against the frozen glass. I froze, heart hammering softly in the quiet. I leaned closer. The air smelled sharper here, metallic, damp, heavy. The ice creaked faintly beneath the subtle pressure, a sound that pressed into the hush of the forest. I pressed my forehead to the frozen surface. The hands below moved slowly, deliberately, stretching upward as though reaching for me, yet unable to break the ice that trapped them. Branches scraped my hair. The fog curled higher, wrapping around my legs, pressing damp and cold against my jacket. The forest held its breath, I whispered softly. No reply. Only the faint creak of ice and the damp hush of the trees. The hands pressed more firmly, yet the ice held them. Something beneath waited, patient, deliberate. I swallowed. The cold pressed deep into my chest, the air heavy, metallic, impossible. The hands below were pale, too thin, human and impossible all at once. They moved, stretching upward, touching the ice as though it could feel their pressure. I pressed my fingers to the surface, cold, hard, unyielding. The reflection above showed my own pale face, tense and unmoving. Yet beneath the hands pressed on, patient and alive. I drew back slowly. The fog pressed tighter around my ankles, branches curling closer, brushing my shoulders. The forest seemed to lean in, attentive, deliberate, alive. The ice creaked faintly again, a low, impossible sound that threaded through the silence, pressing into my chest, curling around my breath. I realized then that the hands were not alone. The surface trembled slightly, as though something beneath the creak was aware of me, watching, waiting. I knelt again, cautious, deliberate, cold pressed against my skin, damp against my jacket. The hands below shifted subtly, palms pressed upward, fingers stretching. They seemed almost human, yet impossible, frozen in motion, trapped beneath the ice. The fog curled higher, pressing closer. Branches scratched my hair and arms. The creek lay still, frozen, holding its secret beneath pale, glassy ice. And the hands waited, patient and deliberate, alive in a way that pressed into the hush of the forest. I whispered my own name, softly, carefully. The sound returned, faint, distorted, threading through the fog. The hands pressed harder, fingers stretching, as if reaching for something beyond the ice, for me, for the warmth of the air, for release. I straightened slowly, boots soft against wet moss and earth. Branches brushed my shoulders. The fog pressed tight around my legs, waist. The forest held its breath, waiting. I stepped back from the frozen creek. The pale hands remained beneath the ice, pressing upward, patient, deliberate, impossible. The surface held them tight, yet I could feel their presence, their awareness, the quiet weight of their waiting. I moved on, careful, slow. Boots sinking softly into moss, leaves damp underfoot. Branches scraped my face, fog curling higher. The creek remained behind me, frozen and silent, yet I could feel the hands beneath, patient, deliberate, alive, and the forest followed, watching. Every step I took pressed into the damp hush. Every breath carried the metallic scent of ice and earth. And I knew the frozen creek remembered me, its trapped hands pressing upward, patient, deliberate, waiting. The trail narrowed between trees, fog curling low around my ankles. Branches brushed my hair and shoulders, dripping cold moisture. The forest smelled damp, earthy, sharp with pine. Then I saw it, a bright red scarf, caught on a low branch, fluttering gently. No wind moved it. The color was impossible against the gray-green of the forest, sharp, vivid, alive. I stepped closer, boots soft on wet moss. The fog pressed around my legs, curling tight and cold. The scarf moved again, gentle, deliberate, swaying as if breathing. I reached out. Fingers brushed the fabric. It was warm, impossibly so, like it had been just held. The warmth pressed through the fibers into my skin. The forest seemed to lean closer, trees stretching overhead, fog curling around roots. A faint sound rose from somewhere deep, soft and high, like the laughter of a child echoing through the mist. I shivered. The scarf pressed against my palm, warm and deliberate. The fog curled tighter around my ankles, around my waist, pressing damp and cold against my jacket. The forest felt smaller somehow, the trees leaning closer. I held the scarf carefully, watching the fog. The laughter rose faintly again, distant, soft, threading between branches, around roots, pressing close to my chest. I whispered softly, almost silently. No reply. Step by careful step, I moved forward. The scarf's warmth seemed to grow with every movement, threading into my skin, into my awareness, pressing close. Impossible. Deliberate, branches scraped my hair, fog curling higher, and I could feel the forest leaning closer, watching, patient, waiting. The scarf tugged lightly in my fingers as though it wanted to be held or to guide me somewhere deeper. I glanced around. The trail stretched into fog, gray and endless. No figure, no one, only the faint sound of that laughter, high, impossible, threading through the mist. The scarf warmed my hand, steady and alive, and the forest seemed to exhale slowly around me. I whispered my own name. The fog swallowed it, thick and damp, yet the laughter echoed softly, impossibly close, threading into the warmth of the scarf in my hand. Step by careful step, I moved on. The trail wound deeper, the forest pressing closer, fog curling higher, brushing my legs, branches scraping against my shoulders. The scarf swayed gently, alive in my grasp. I pressed it to my chest. Warmth spread, soft and deliberate, and the air felt heavier, closer, as though the trees themselves leaned toward me. The laughter rose again, faint, distant, then closer, threading through the fog, around roots and branches pressing against my chest. I could feel the forest tightening, every step pressing into the hush, the fog curling higher, more deliberate, more patient. I stepped forward slowly, careful, deliberate. The scarf tugged lightly in my hand, warm, alive, impossible. Branches brushed my face, fog pressed against my chest, and I felt the forest breathing around me, patient, deliberate. The laughter rose once more, soft, high, impossible. The scarf fluttered gently, still warm. I realized the forest felt tighter, closer, leaning toward me as though it remembered the touch, the warmth, the presence. I moved on. The trail wound deeper into fog, branches brushing shoulders, dripping cold moisture. The red scarf swayed in my hand, alive, patient, deliberate. The laughter echoed softly, threading through the mist, and the forest pressed close, watching, waiting. Impossible. Step by careful step, I felt the warmth, the tug, the presence, and the fog curled higher around my ankles, wrapping, patient, deliberate, holding me in the hush of the forest. Alive with impossible memory, and the red scarf pulsed gently in my hand. The trees opened suddenly. A clearing waited ahead, silent, still, almost perfect. Fog pressed low to the ground, curling between roots and stones. The air felt heavy, old, the kind of quiet that listens back. In the center stood a well. Stone, dark with moss and rain, its rim cracked and soft at the edges. A circle of wet leaves clung to the stones like old skin. I stepped closer. Each footfall sank into the damp soil, the faintest drip of water echoing somewhere deep below. The rope and bucket were gone. Only the wooden frame remained, leaning to one side, its beam dark with time. The smell hit me first. Wet moss, cold iron, and something faintly metallic, like old water left to rot. The closer I came, the louder the dripping became, steady, patient, deep. I stopped beside it. The stones were slick beneath my fingers. The rim was colder than it should have been. I leaned forward. Darkness waited below. No bottom in sight. Just that steady, soft, dripping, drip, drip, drip. Each drop echoed longer than the one before, like the well was growing deeper as I listened. The sound vibrated up through the stones, into my fingers, into my chest. I whispered softly. My voice fell into the dark and didn't come back. Only the drip answered. Drip, drip. The fog curled closer around my legs. The trees at the edge of the clearing stood still, watching, almost leaning in. I thought about leaving. But something about the sound held me. I took out my phone. The screen glowed faintly, white light bending against the fog. I pointed it down into the dark. Nothing. Just a black pit swallowing the light whole. No reflection, no bottom, only motionless dark. The dripping grew slower now, as though something far below had stopped to listen. I turned the light away. The air felt heavier. The fog was thicker now, and every part of me wanted to step back, but I didn't. I leaned closer. My breath drifted down into the well, curling like smoke into the dark. And then, for a heartbeat, something moved below. Not the drip, not the echo, movement slow, deliberate, rising. I held my breath. The air pressed cold against my face. And then, eyes. Two pale eyes, faintly glowing, staring up from the dark. Unblinking, perfectly still. I froze. My throat tightened, heartbeat pressing against the inside of my ribs. The eyes didn't move, just watched. For a long moment, nothing else existed. No wind, no sound, only that steady, impossible stare. And then the dripping began again, but not below. Behind me, drip, drip, drip. I turned slowly. The fog was thicker now, the trees like silhouettes in milk. A drop of water slid down the back of my neck, cold, sharp. I stepped away from the well, but the sound followed. Drip, drip. Each step I took made it louder, closer, until I realized it wasn't falling. It was breathing, slow, wet breaths, just behind the edge of hearing. The fog curled tighter, pressing against my skin, and the air around the well seemed to pull inward, like it was inhaling. The eyes below brightened faintly, and something like a whisper rose up, not words, just sound. A soft, low hum that vibrated against the stones. I took another step back. The fog followed. The hum deepened. The well exhaled. A rush of cold air spilled out, carrying the scent of iron and wet earth, thick enough to sting the back of my throat. The fog around the clearing stirred once, then settled again. The hum stopped. The dripping faded. Silence returned. I looked down one last time. The eyes were gone. Only darkness now, smooth and deep and waiting. The trees leaned closer around the clearing. Branches creaked softly. The ground felt softer underfoot, like it might sink if I stayed too long. I turned and walked away. Each step sank into wet earth. The fog trailed after me, slow, deliberate, clinging to my legs. Behind me, a single drop echoed again from deep below, one last drip, as though the well had swallowed its breath. And for the rest of the walk home, I could still feel those eyes, low, patient, and waiting, just beneath the surface of the world. The trail curved downward into a hollow. The air there felt different, still, heavy, as if sound didn't quite reach this part of the forest. Fog drifted between the trees, thick enough to blur their shapes into gray outlines. Each step sank softly into damp leaves, and for a while there was nothing but my breath. Then I saw it, a single wooden chair, sitting alone at the center of the hollow, facing the trail. Its legs were sunk deep into the soil, the seat slick with moisture. It looked like it had been there for years, but the wood wasn't rotted, just damp, dark, and waiting. Something rested on the chair, a small black tape recorder. Old, heavy. Its surface glistened faintly with dew. I stood still for a long moment, listening to the forest breathe. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked softly. I stepped closer. The fog curled around my knees. The air smelled faintly of wet bark and iron. Each step felt too loud. When I reached the chair, I hesitated. The tape recorder was old but clean, buttons dark and worn smooth. Someone had wiped it recently. Someone had used it. I brushed my thumb across the play button. The plastic was cold. I waited, half expecting to hear footsteps behind me. But there was only silence. Then I pressed play. A soft click. A rush of static. Then footsteps, slow even. Gravel shifting under weight. Breath following softly after. For a moment, I thought it was mine. But it wasn't. The rhythm was the same as my own steps, but a half-second off, like something had been walking just behind me. The breath grew louder, soft and wet close to the recorder. Then I heard a faint whisper, not words, just air moving through teeth. I froze. My heartbeat pressed against my ribs, each pulse echoing in the silence around me. The recording went on. Footsteps, breath, a pause, then my name, spoken softly, almost like an exhale. The fog thickened around me, curling up past my waist. The trees seemed to close in, their shapes bending toward the chair. The voice on the tape whispered again, closer this time, not from the speaker, but from behind it. I turned slowly. The fog swallowed the trail behind me, soft and colorless. No shape, no sound, only stillness. The tape hissed faintly. Footsteps started again. This time, there were two sets, one soft, one heavier, both in rhythm. Breath joining them, my breath and someone else's. I crouched beside the chair. The recorder's reel turned lazily, the sound warping like a heartbeat through the static. And then I heard it. A faint rustle, close to the microphone, as if someone had leaned down to whisper. A voice, low and careful. "I see you," the recorder clicked off. Silence filled the hollow. The trees didn't move. The fog didn't drift. Even the birds had stopped. I stared at the small black device, its empty reel turning softly, as though it was still remembering the sound. The wood beneath my hand was damp, slick, cold. And then I noticed a faint indentation in the soil beside the chair. Footprints, fresh, deep enough that water had pooled in them. Each step led up the trail, toward where I'd come from. My stomach tightened. The air felt heavier now, and the fog clung to my face like damp cloth. I pressed stop on the recorder, but it clicked again on its own, static. Then, footsteps, closer this time, matching mine exactly. The breath followed, soft, wet, almost gentle. And somewhere between the noise and silence, I heard a second whisper. It wasn't on the tape. It was behind me. I turned. Nothing. The fog was solid white now, the hollow disappearing into it. The sound stopped, only the chair remained. And the recorder, still running, still listening, I left it there. Walked away slowly, feeling the fog shift behind me like something moving through it, keeping pace. All the way home, I could still hear the faint echo of my steps, repeating just behind me. Perfectly timed, perfectly familiar. And when I reached my door, I realized something simple, something cold. Those weren't my footsteps on the recording. They were recordings of me. The trail wound upward, narrow and slick with damp leaves. Fog curled between the trees, thick at my ankles, curling higher with every step. The forest smelled of wet pine and earth, sharp, metallic, heavy. At first, I thought it was the wind. A soft rustle, branches brushing against one another, leaves trembling not from my steps, but from something else. Then it became obvious. The whole forest moved, not in wind, not with sound. The trees rose slightly, their trunks stretching, bending like ribs. The fog followed, shifting as though drawn by the motion. I stopped, boots sinking into wet moss, heart hammering softly. A low hum pressed through the air. Subtle at first, then deeper, vibrating through the ground, threading into the fog, into my bones. I watched, breath shallow. Branches swayed upward, leaves lifted in waves, and the forest inhaled, slow, deliberate, patient. The exhale came then. Branches rattled, leaves shaking violently, and I felt the pulse through the roots beneath my boots. The air shifted, dense and cold, pressing damp against my jacket. Step by careful step, I moved forward. The fog pressed close, clinging to ankles, curling around wrists. Every inhale from the forest felt heavy, alive, and every exhale rattled the leaves, shaking the path beneath me. I whispered softly. No reply. Only the rustle of leaves and the subtle vibration that moved through the fog like a heartbeat. The rhythm grew faster. Inhale, exhale, branches rising, falling. Leaves brushing against each other, against my jacket, my arms, my hair. The forest was breathing around me, alive in a way I had never known. Each inhalation drew the fog tighter, pressing against my legs, curling around my boots. Each exhale rattled leaves and branches, shaking the hush of night into a low roar. I stumbled slightly, boots slipping on wet moss. The air smelled sharper now, metallic, earthy, impossible. The pulse of the forest pressed into my chest, synchronizing with my own breath, slowing, quickening, impossible to separate. I glanced around. The fog thickened, curling higher. The trees leaned subtly inward, trunks bending with slow, deliberate strength, their leaves brushing together as though in conversation. I realized I was inside something alive. Step by careful step, I moved forward. The forest exhaled, rattling leaves violently, then inhaled, drawing the fog tight around my waist. My boots sank softly into wet earth, the sound swallowed in the pulse of movement. The rhythm grew faster still, every inhale deeper, more deliberate, every exhale louder, pressing closer. I felt the roots beneath me shift slightly, the ground pressing upward, holding, guiding, alive in its patience. I whispered my name. It returned faintly, distorted, threading through the fog, leaves, trunks. The forest responded not with voice, but with motion. Branches bending, leaves trembling, fog swirling higher, pressing into my chest, into my skin, into my breath. I stumbled again, heart racing, chest tight. The forest inhaled. The exhale rattled every leaf around me, shaking me to my knees. I pressed my palms to the ground, cold, wet, solid, but alive beneath my fingers. The pulse of the forest ran through the soil, through roots and rocks and fallen branches, threading into my veins. And then, slowly, I understood. Every breath I took was mirrored. The forest inhaled when I inhaled, exhaled when I exhaled, wrapping me inside it, patient, deliberate, alive. I rose slowly. Step by careful step, I moved forward. Branches scraped hair and shoulders, fog clinging, the forest breathing around me, its pulse relentless, deliberate. I whispered again. No voice answered. Only the inhale, the exhale, the tremor through leaves and roots, the patient, impossible rhythm of something alive. I did not stop. I could not stop. The forest followed every step, every breath pressing closer, watching, waiting, patient. And when I finally left the hollowed trail behind, the memory remained. The forest breathed around me, alive, patient, deliberate, and I was still inside it. The trail narrowed suddenly. Small stones lined the edges, damp and slick with fog. The air smelled of wet earth, pine, and something faintly metallic. Branches reached low, brushing my arms as I stepped carefully. The path felt familiar, but wrong. Too still. Too quiet, and the fog clung to my legs like wet cloth. I followed the trail slowly. Each step pressed into the soft soil, leaves curling around my ankles. The stones beneath my boots made no sound, yet I felt their weight underfoot. Ahead, the trail ended. A clearing waited. And there it was, my house. At first I thought I had returned home. The shape, the roof, the familiar outline. But the darkness felt different. It was heavier, deeper, wrong. The door was closed. No light spilled from windows. Shadows pooled unnaturally, bending around the corners of the porch. I stepped closer. The air pressed cold against my face. Branches scraped against the siding, fog curling around my legs, wet and thick. I reached the window. Peering inside, my chest tightened. Everything was wrong. Furniture arranged backwards. Cabinet doors opened to reveal empty darkness. Chairs turned in impossible angles. The room stretched subtly, as though it were reshaping itself quietly, deliberately. And then, my reflection, it didn't move with me. Its eyes followed softly, patiently, yet its movements were not mine. The subtle tilt of the head, the shift of weight across the floor, all wrong, just a fraction off. I swallowed. The air tasted metallic, damp, impossibly close. I pressed my forehead to the glass, careful. The reflection stayed still, watching, patient. Branches scratched the windows, fog pressed tight against my legs, and the house seemed to inhale. The shadows inside shifted ever so slightly, gathering toward me. Step by careful step, I circled the building. The shape remained familiar, but the feeling of home had vanished. The walls leaned subtly, corners curling inward like fingers, pulling at the edges of reality. I whispered softly. No answer. Only the quiet hiss of fog curling around the stones, pressing damp and cold against my boots. I pressed a hand to the doorknob. Cold, slick metal. It turned easily. The door creaked faintly as it opened, filling the porch with damp, heavy air. Inside, the room stretched strangely. Every familiar object felt distant, as if memory itself had been warped. I stepped inside carefully, boots soft on the floor. The air smelled of damp wood and something else. Something faintly alive, deliberate, impossible. I moved slowly through the rooms. Each one mirrored home, but twisted. Small things shifted subtly out of place. My shadow didn't follow, and my reflection from the window hadn't moved either. I stopped in the center of the living room. The fog seemed to press through the walls, curling around my ankles, damp and cold. And then I heard it, soft, deliberate, patient. A faint whisper just behind my ear. Not words, just breath, warm, impossibly close. I turned slowly. Nothing moved. The silence pressed tight, thick, deliberate, patient. The house waited. I realized then that the trail had brought me here, but not home. Something else had waited, patient and deliberate. It knew me. It watched me. I took a careful step back. The air pressed cold against my skin, branches scratching outside, fog curling around the doorframe. The reflection in the window remained still. The furniture remained backward, and the house exhaled quietly around me. I stepped outside. The trail behind me had vanished, replaced by fog thick as walls, pressing close, patient. Deliberate, I could feel the weight of the house watching. And somewhere deep, the trail stretched onward, narrow, impossible, leading nowhere I recognized. I whispered softly. No answer. Only the hush of the fog and the impossible stillness of home. The journey back was longer than I remembered. Fog pressed low to the ground, curling between roots and stones, weaving through the trees like slow fingers. The forest smelled damp, sharp with pine, and something older, metallic like iron left to rust. Every step pressed into wet earth. The fog wrapped around my ankles, rising higher, tight and deliberate, like it was holding me close. When I finally saw my porch light, it flickered softly, buzzing faintly in the fog. A pale glow, small and steady, yet it felt wrong. I walked slowly up the path. Leaves crushed softly under my boots. Branches scraped the edges of my jacket, and the fog pressed around my chest, damp and cold. At the door, someone waited, silent, still, facing me. The figure didn't move. No breath, no blink. Just waiting, patient, deliberate. I swallowed. The air felt heavier here. The porch smelled faintly of wet wood and fog, the faint metallic tang lingering from the forest. The figure was familiar. Its shape, height, the curve of its shoulders. But wrong. A stillness that pressed, an absence of life in the outline. Like a shadow that had stepped out of memory and held itself in form. I stepped closer. The porch creaked softly underfoot, but the figure did not flinch. Fog curled around my legs tighter, pressing cold against my skin. I whispered softly. No reply, only the faint buzz of the light. My hand reached for the doorknob, metal cold and slick beneath my fingers. It turned easily. The soft click echoed small and deliberate. The figure did not move. I paused, breath shallow, heart pressing against my ribs, fog curling closer, almost tactile. Then the door unlocked fully. Click. The porch light flickered again, buzzed faintly, uncertain. And I noticed the figure was not stepping back. It hadn't moved an inch. It had been waiting here all along. I inhaled slowly, careful, deliberate. The fog pressed against my chest, damp and cold, curling between fingers, and I realized the weight of every step I had taken had led me here, to this quiet, patient presence. I stepped inside. The floor was cold beneath my boots. The air smelled of home, but wrong. Wood, faintly damp, with the metallic tang still lingering. The furniture sat where it should, yet the stillness pressed, heavy and deliberate. I turned. The figure was gone. Or maybe it had never moved. I couldn't tell. The hush of the house wrapped around me, thick and deliberate, pressing against my ears. Footsteps? Perhaps my own. Or perhaps the echo of someone else's, mirrored, patient, following close behind. I felt the fog from the forest still there, pressing lightly through walls and windows, curling along the floorboards. And somewhere deep I felt it. The figure, patient, waiting, watching, even when unseen. I moved to the window. The reflection was mine, or nearly mine. Shadows lingered behind my eyes, subtle, impossible, shaping themselves into something familiar, yet wrong. I whispered softly. No answer, only the hush of the house, the faint buzz of the porch light outside, the impossible stillness of someone or something waiting. I walked to the door again. The figure remained outside. Silent, unmoving, patient, I reached for the handle. Cold, slick metal. The fog pressed in through the cracks around the doorframe, wrapping damp and deliberate around my ankles. Click. The door swung open slowly. I stepped through. The figure did not move, did not blink, did not breathe. I closed the door behind me. Click, and then it was quiet. Heavy, impossible, patient. The porch light flickered one last time. Buzzed faintly, then stabilized. I stood still. Alone, inside, but the sense of being watched remained. The figure outside had not left. It had only waited. I sank into the nearest chair. Fog curled at the edges of the window, touching the glass like soft fingers. Every breath I took echoed faintly, as if mirrored just beyond the pane. I whispered my own name, softly, deliberately. No reply. Only the hush of the house, the quiet press of fog and shadow, and the sense of someone waiting patiently outside. And in that quiet I understood, home had always been this way. The figure had been waiting for me all along. Click, the door unlocked itself. Slow, soft, deliberate. The hush pressed closer, and I did not move.